Goes down to the store to steal the drink. When I fingers the girl, oh, it stinks, 'cause they don't wash their vagina. My hands get sticky like they were covered in Aunt Jemima. I got my name on the back seat of the bus. You don't sit back there, you'll have to deal with us. CBS thinks they're tough. They came in here and tried to get rough. But we put them in their place by punching them in the face. They dripped down the gutter, punched him in the face like it was butter. He throws VCRs at his mother. He pokes the Nicky with his dicky, little Dicky. Hello, my name is Ian, and today we're talking about hip-hop in a post-insular community, hybridity, local language, and authenticity in an online Newfoundland rap group by Sandra, Clarke, and Philip Hiscock. Sandra Clarke is a linguist. Philip Hiscock he's trained as a linguist, but he is also a folklorist, and he's what brings the folklore edge to this. Bit of a word of warning, in addition to a certain amount of content warning given the lyrics, but this is a linguistics article, not a folklore article per se. And it's filled with some technical terms that are particular to linguistics that I don't quite understand, and I'm not necessarily expecting you will understand either. Maybe you do. Distinct possibility that you are smarter and better read than I. But just remember that when we enter into a different field of discourse, they have their own particular highly specialized vocabulary because they are looking to describe things with greater and greater precision so that when they have this conversation about the thing, everyone knows what they are talking about. So that is all the stuff about diphthongs, all the stuff about rounded vowels. If you don't understand them, don't worry about it. Just let it flow. Let it pass over you. Say they are describing something, and they give examples of what they mean. It's like, oh, that's the word for this. That's cool. If you wish to pursue it further, that's up to you. But for the most part, just like it's not about being ignorant. It's about I don't have this level of specialization, yet I can still follow. Never be fearful of an article if you don't understand the words. Google exists. And often you don't even need that because you get the general impression because we're much more interested in the larger point. And what is the larger point? This is a description of a group called Gazebo Unit, which emerged in 2005. Basically, a bunch of 14 or 15-year-olds from the neighborhood of Airport Heights, which is just outside of St. John's. Well, no, it's still technically within St. John's city limits, I believe. It is outside of the downtown. It's about a 10-minute drive from downtown St. John's, and it's not too far from the airport, hence its name, Airport Heights. And it's a perfectly lovely suburb. Maybe there's a reputation as a suburb for street gangs or whatever. But Gazebo Unit emerged in that first decade of the 21st century area with LimeWire and MySpace pages and so on, where people were able to disseminate their music through those forums. And what made them distinct was that they sang, they performed their raps with a remarkably thick Newfoundland accent, a highly stylized Newfoundland accent, which other Newfoundland hip-hop groups didn't participate in. Hip-hop as a genre has as its baseline, in many ways, African-American speech, not simply in terms of terminology, but in terms of particular forms of inflection, and also terms of what constitutes a taboo and a not taboo word. And non-African American hip-hop groups tend to avoid something that sounds like mimicry and yet nevertheless is indexing African American speech. There are other forms of hip-hop that also do participate, and whether by choice or whether by circumstance, participate in the accents of the rappers themselves. And so you come across some interesting Northern English rap. You come across, and certainly once you leave English as the language of rap, you come across French and Danish and so on. And no longer that sort of need to index African American, although again, it's still, there's a certain amount of it in its DNA. Other groups at the time in Newfoundland didn't seem to speak in accent, didn't seem to rap in the thick accent. They were still in that process of emulating forms, but they weren't participating in a mimicry of African American speech, nor were they particularly inflected. The occasional word might have come through, but inflection of their accent wasn't particularly the point. Gazebo unit, very much so. So what was happening is that I think they're participating in what is a long-standing form of humor. Clarke and Hiscock, basically by the end, suggest that gazebo unit are engaged in some kind of parody. Now, the parody isn't simple. The parody isn't just simply making fun of, in a disparaging way, the Newfoundland accent and the characteristic of the skeet, the identity that they picked up. And we'll talk about skeet in a second. Rather, the parody seems to be this, nuanced isn't quite the right word, but this sort of reflection on the presentation of the Newfoundlander in the popular culture, something that can be embraced with a certain amount of fondness and yet not necessarily something that one wishes to embrace to its fullest. And I think you come across a lot of that in regional styles and regional forms of comedy. You certainly come across it elsewhere in Atlantic Canada, where and it's particularly marked by accent and the adoption and the adaptation of an accent that is seen to be particular of a place. What is more is that accent isn't necessarily something that any individual speaker naturally has, and yet certainly is reminiscent of it. Again, caricature, I use the expression, isn't quite the right word, but we could still dance around it. Caricature is one of those, in that it emphasizes, distorts to bring attention to nuances of speech. And so as one listens to parodic acts, or people who've inflected their language in this way, you can recognize the accent that is being indexed without necessarily recognizing this as an authentic reflection or an authentic depiction of the accent. In the article, Clarke and Hiscock talk about in registering, which is a term in linguistics, which another term, a more sort of sociologically rooted term, is code switching. The idea that within particular contexts one picks up or drops speech patterns depending on the group that one is in, and so and one can do it in a deliberate way and in a playful way. One can be speaking and with a voice that is often inflected of some description, because that is one's natural the habit of how one is speaking. And a linguist with a more refined vocabulary could give you a more refined way of suggesting that. But different stresses on various vowels, or the length of certain vowels. But at moments of play, at moments of particularly the speech that happens in third places, one can participate more fully in that accent, and it's almost subconscious, but it can be done consciously as well. And one switches deliberately to one's accent in order to emphasize something, and emphasize not simply reframing the situation, that I'm moving away from serious talk to playful talk, although that's part of it, but also that in the playful talk I am speaking through almost the level of the character. Like if you've ever spoken to someone in Atlantic Canada, and they might be sort of going about their daily talk, and then it's like, well, how was your weekend? And then they're like, oh, and even that sort of, oh, it's the bridge into some kind of accented speech, which is, and the vernacular will be different, the grammar will be ever so slightly less standard English, and one is moving into a certain field of discourse. So, gazebo unit, I think, are participating in that. and it engendered a remarkable amount of discussion. For one thing, because it attracted attention to itself, and it was, despite the fact that there was a Newfoundland hip hop community with several bands, several groups that also distributed their music in the same kind of means. Basically recording it and putting it online in sort of that early pre-YouTube manifestation of this. They all of a sudden the popular media was saying, "Oh, look, Newfoundland finally has its own hip hop scene," because Gazebo Unit was, I was going to say unapologetically, but they were clearly carving themselves out as Newfoundland, appealing to a whole host of different understandings of Newfoundlanding. I should write that down. A whole host of different expectations, as much esoteric as exoteric. Now, their language, with their topicality, on one hand, it suggested that they're very much speaking within the framework of there's the violent themes of gangster rap and so on, and the hyper masculinity and the anti-authoritarianism and the notions of violence and the notions of misogyny that are present in gangster rap, and again, which are already a sort of a carnivalesque frame. And I refer you to the discourse on hip hop in general about that, but doing so by referring to airport heights and airport heights geography. The gazebo is just a park structure that they would hang out in. All these passing references to the corner stores and so on that are part of their community. Incredibly esoteric references that are part of the play of it. So just like gangster rap tends to ground its fantasia of violence and misogyny within set locations, within a sort of a fixed, recognizable world, Gazebo Unit is doing the same thing within this realm of Airport Heights. And rather than present themselves as gangstas, they're presenting themselves as skeets. Skeet being a term that emerged late 20th century, early 21st, to describe a certain character of Newfoundlander, similar to chavs, similar to other disparaged populations. The typically white, typically representing marginalized regions, working class, lower working class, obsessed with material culture, obsessed with sort of bling, as it were, an easily, quickly disparageable and somewhat contemptuous category. Again, this is a disparagement, but then something that one could potentially claim for one's own, and a very problematic category. Though skeets can be found among the urban working classes, the term is still perhaps more frequently applied to rural residents of the province, those whose phonological and grammatical features are decidedly local and non-standard, and whose activities eschew mainstream normative practice. So there's two issues of this authenticity. One is the authenticity of their accent, how they are actually representing. Maybe there's three things. One is how they're actually representing Newfoundland speech patterns, and how much is an exaggeration to the point of mockery. Are they mocking the Newfoundland speech pattern by doing so? Are they being playful, or are they mocking? And that's always a fine line that people tend to negotiate, but still it's sort of recognizably the same. Certainly comments on their MySpace pages, or comments on other places where their lyrics were posted or their music was posted and people could reflect, would point out to the almost ridiculous level of accent that was felt. The second is whether they are playing with or mocking the idea of hip hop itself, and what they were doing. And certainly this idea that they are certainly the sort of hostility that was felt towards them by other members of the Newfoundland hip hop community. It's like, you are doing this a disservice. You are attracting attention to it through your sort of playful antics, and I make it sound like they're all sort of staunch grandmothers, but like, you are taking this thing and discrediting it. Now, the only thing that people can think of when they think about Newfoundland hip hop are you people who are clearly not simply making fun of Newfoundlanders, you're also making fun of hip hop itself. There's other Newfoundland hip hop would mention and would refer to Newfoundland topics. It would be localized because hip hop has this level of authenticity. Again, that sort of keeping it real aspect. Whether we're talking about the fantasia of gangster rap or whether we're talking about other forms, about you don't speak about other people's context, you speak about your own context, and it's born out of lived experience. And so Newfoundland hip hop is talking about Newfoundland issues and Newfoundland topics. So it's not the Newfoundland part, it's this hyper blown up Newfoundland part that other hip hop artists are challenging Gazebo Unit to. And then the third is, are they participating in or are they mocking the idea of the skeet? Because these are 14-year-old suburban kids who are just going into high school, and they're clearly not even able to live this sort of skeet lifestyle. They're not old enough to be buying all the gin and juice at the stores. They can't be living this rebel life, and yet nevertheless here they are being presented as such and being presented as the same. So what are they doing? What is their challenge? And so it becomes this through language first and foremost, and then through the form that it takes, and then through the character that is being presented and represented and claimed. You have this whole insight into the issue of Newfoundland identity, Newfoundland rural identity, Newfoundland class identity, both using a form that is globalized and has its own set of expectations. So why we talk about this, why this would be an interesting one for folklore, is that the idea that there is a vehicle of expression that is clearly not originating within a Newfoundland context, and yet can be, because the folk are always, again, as I always say, the folk are always contemporary to their times, can be adapted by Newfoundlanders for expressive means, for doing the identity work, that are clearly, they are not recognizing, they are not proclaiming themselves to be participating in this sort of capital N, capital T Newfoundland tradition that has its own gatekeepers and its own set of expectations and its own history and its own aesthetics. Nevertheless, they are speaking, they are making a claim to speak to issues in Newfoundland culture. But what happens when you take that, all of which is possible, and then you enter into that issue of parody? What are the consequences? How can it be interpreted? How can it be misinterpreted? How is it that potentially people from the community are like, that I'm okay with it until it becomes misinterpreted by someone else? Like, this is genuine. And if people from Alberta, people from New Zealand listen to Gazebo Unit and think that this is an actual form, an actual representation, even if they understand the fantasia hermeneutic of gangster rap, that this is an accurate representation of Newfoundland culture and Newfoundland accents, like, oh, well, what's going on here? The concern that other people aren't going to get the joke, and therefore potentially the joke shouldn't be made. That seems to be the issue. And towards the end, as I said, one of the things that's possible is that this isn't a mockery, because they're 14-year-old boys who are, of course, are able to mock and able to be insincere, and are able to be disparaging, and are able to simply tear down, but it doesn't necessarily seem to be the case entirely. Rather, that through something that is nevertheless playful, that nevertheless is not meant to be taken seriously, they are able to negotiate this already potentially difficult, potentially questionable form of identity that young suburban Newfoundlanders are going through in the beginning of the 21st century. So what does it mean? The basic sort of question of what does it mean to be of this place has taken some kind of form through a art form that is not particular to this place, doesn't have its origins in this place, but is a globalized one, and yet is actively participated in, at least on the audience level, by people in this place when they are not putting on their capital and Newfoundland hats and are just, again, contemporary people. So it's a really interesting article about representation, about the threat or the perception of misrepresentation, about how potentially through deliberate distortion there's another kind of representation that's actually happening. And all of which, nevertheless, needs to be brought into the idea of play. Of that they are clearly having fun with the form, but does having fun with the form, having fun with the accent, having fun with the concept of skeet, is having fun, is it necessarily a belittling critique? That's the question. It's a great article. It has all those fancy linguistics terms, which makes me feel clever when I'm actually reading them. But nevertheless, it speaks. And it speaks to this thing that happens in Atlantic Canada where we are able to turn around and use what is at our disposal to be creative, to express something. And to express something seems very modest, but it's all there is, really. Anyway, I have taken up enough of your time. My name is Ian. Today we have been talking about, deep breath, because there's so many names and such a long title, Sandra Clarke and Philip Hiscock's Hip Hop in a Post-insular Community, Hybridity, Local Language, and Authenticity in an Online Newfoundland Rap Group. As ever, I wish you nothing but the best, and bye-bye.